Welcome back, my dear followers. This is a new episode of The History of the American Mafia, a podcast written by Fabio Fabiano and translated and read by Grace Carlisi. I do hope you enjoy today's new episode. This is part 3 of a 5-part series dedicated to Lucky Luciano. With the new commission created by Luciano, the American Mafia also, thanks to Meyer Lansky's collaboration, underwent a radical transformation. From the Prohibition era and the extortion rackets, the mafia families began to approach the global drug trafficking market. Opium grown in Asia and refined in Sicily was distributed everywhere. The mafia bosses transformed into highly efficient managers, became import-export experts. Huge quantities of narcotic substances were imported along with the typical Sicilian products. Lucky Luciano, after establishing the commission, reached the peak of his criminal career. He was living in a luxurious suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, registered under the false name of Charles Ross. He occupied Suite 36C, a very luxurious 3-room apartment for an entire year at a cost of over $100,000 per year. He always dressed in designer clothes and led a lavish lifestyle. He even had a private plane to go on holiday to Miami and other prestigious tourist locations, and pampered with expensive and luxurious gifts the women he entertained. He became friends with Frank Sinatra. His rackets also extended to the fashion industry. He joined the Jewish gangsters who controlled the Fashion Workers Union. Once they had control of the unions, Luciano's mafia family was able to blackmail the manufacturers, who were then forced to pay bribes to avoid disputes with the workers that would have blocked the production. Despite being the first among equals of the mafia bosses of the 5 families, Luciano kept a very low profile. Like all great bosses, he preferred to move behind the scenes. Politically, he sided to Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party led by Irish leaders, which effectively constituted the dominant political force in New York. This allowed the political formation to choose the mayors to be elected, control the election of prosecutors and police department leaders, who, in fact, didn't affect mafia interests and didn't prosecute the New York mafia families. It seemed things were looking good for Luciano, and that he had everything under control, but it was only so on the surface. What he didn't know was New York County District Attorney Thomas Dewey was investigating him undercover. The prosecutors, collaborators, and he himself, despite Luciano's attempts to remain in the shadows, were aware of his high rank in the organized crime and his political connections. The investigators were not fooled by Luciano's declarations regarding his considerable earnings deriving exclusively from winnings from gambling and sports betting and from his bookmaking activity. Prosecutor Dewey was given the task of eradicating the lottery racket, and it became immediately clear that that wasn't the prosecutor's only interest. In 1935, Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey began gathering evidence aimed at bringing charges against Lucky Luciano. Initially, he found no evidence at all. It proved to be really difficult to find confirmation through wiretaps. Luciano was very careful and knew how to use his words when speaking on the phone. He never kept anything in writing regarding his criminal affairs. The cautious boss kept everything in his head and memorized everything he needed to know, so it was quite a venture finding anything to incriminate him. The turning point came when Dewey's agents unexpectedly came across a series of leads indicating Luciano at the head of the prostitution racket. It all started with Eunice Carter, the only woman on his team, noticed the widespread practice of tainting trials whenever prostitutes were indicted. Initially, Dewey wasn't interested in prosecuting prostitutes or brothel owners, But when he realized that the investigation could lead him to certain criminals connected to Luciano, he intensified his investigative activity. He began wiretapping the brothel phone lines, and following his investigative activity, he managed to identify a criminal organization that had control of 300 brothels, in which approximately 2,000 girls were employed. Thanks to this investigation, it was established that the Italian criminal organization had replaced the Jewish one in the exploitation of prostitution. Another important finding due to this same investigation was the identification of David Petillo. His real name was Davide Petillo. At the registry office, he was born in 1908 in Manhattan, New York, from Italian parents. Petillo used to accompany Lucky Luciano and was responsible for managing the brothels, from which he made millions of dollars a year. 1936, policemen led by the New York Special Prosecutor raided 8 brothels simultaneously. They ended up arresting hundreds of prostitutes, pimps, and landladies. Those arrested, who admitted their responsibilities in order to be released, testified that they were part of a huge prostitution ring. Furthermore, and this was the turning point, 3 prostitutes declared that Charles Lucky Luciano was involved in the ring. Following these statements, Luciano was arrested and tried between May and July 1936. His bail was set at $350,000, approximately $6 million in today. This sum was a record for New York. The prosecutor defined the accused as a Tsar of organized crime and head of the Prostitution Racket Association. The testimony that most implicated Luciano was that of a prostitute named Cokie Flo Brown. The woman declared that her protector once met Luciano and had had a discussion with him on how to manage the brothels, and that he intended to adopt the same procedures as a commercial enterprise. Another prostitute declared that she had heard Luciano giving orders to his men to punish a maitresse who was not inclined to collaborate with his organization. How Luciano lived like a nabob, declaring an annual income of just over $25,000, and the circumstance for which he was exonerated by accusing another drug dealer violating the code of silence, spoke negatively in his favor. The court found him guilty on 62 counts. David Petillo and Charlie Lucky Luciano were convicted and sent to prison on charges of forced prostitution. David Bellito's sentence was 25 to 40 years, while Lucky got 30 years in prison. However, despite being incarcerated in a maximum security facility, Luciano continued to operate his criminal activities outside the penitentiary. Some inmates took care of his chores. Even one of the inmates was forced to become his personal chef.